Dr. Venkatraman Ramakrishnan, thank you for joining us today. There are 10 Indians who have won Nobel Prizes, 4 in science, and you're the only one in chemistry. You do us proud.
Thank you.
You won the Nobel Prize in chemistry for work in the ribosomal structure. And you also received the Padma Bhushan, knighted in 2012, a member of the US National Academy of Sciences and foreign member of the Indian National Science Academy. In 2015, Dr. Venkatraman was elected as the president of the Royal Society. Also welcome Dr. Jogen Desai, founder and CEO of iSystem, Bangalore-based life sciences entrepreneur looking to disrupt the cell therapy ecosystem. He's also the director of the Ignite Life Science Foundation. Dr. Venkatraman, your enormous success draws parallels in the entrepreneurial world. I belong to the entrepreneurial world, and we thought the entrepreneurial world could learn a lot from your journey to where you are today. My first question is very simple. For many of us, or many of the entrepreneurs who don't belong to the life sciences, could you tell a little bit more about your discovery?
Okay, so, everybody has heard of genes, and they all think they know what genes are, but actually if you ask them what is a gene, they only have a vague idea. They say, gene, that gives us, we inherit genes, we inherit good genes or bad genes, and, maybe they inherit eye color or hair color and so on. But they don't actually know what a gene is. And if you probe them further, and you say, well, where are these genes? They say, there's something to do with DNA. And then if you ask them about DNA, again, they sort of know that it's something to do with heredity, inheritance, etc., but they don't know really what's actually happening. And so we have thousands of genes, and genes are essentially units of information. You can think of each gene as a book or a sentence, whatever analogy you want. Let's say it's a book of instructions. And it's essentially a book of instructions on how to make a protein. You can think of it as a very long sentence of instructions to make a protein. So what are proteins? Well, proteins are long chains. They're polymers which fold up into particular three-dimensional shapes. And they're made of 20 types of amino acids. Each amino acid has a somewhat different chemical property. And so you can have a whole string of amino acids, and the order of amino acids and the number of them defines a protein. And the amazing thing is that once you make this protein chain, just that order is enough to allow it to, has information to allow the chain to fold up into a particular three-dimensional shape. And it's that three-dimensional shape that gives each protein its function. So for example, you have a long triple-stranded protein called collagen, which makes up your skin and cartilage. Every Indian student of science should know that because the structure of collagen was first elucidated by G.N. Ramachandran, who actually worked in Bangalore for quite many years.
Many years, yeah.
And so that's one kind of protein. Another is a more sort of roundish protein, a globular protein called hemoglobin, which carries oxygen in our blood. Another protein sits in the retina of the membranes of in cells in your eye and detects light, called rhodopsin. Without it, you wouldn't be able to see. So this is just to show you 3 different proteins, completely different functions, and there are 20,000 of them which carry out, all of the functions of life. Now, what the ribosome is it's the thing that reads the genetic instructions and actually makes the protein. So you can think of DNA, some people have called it a blueprint, other people have called it a recipe. I think a recipe is a better analogy, because depending on the environment and what sort of kitchen you have and et cetera, and what sort of ingredients you have, the cake might not turn out exactly the same way, but pretty much a chocolate cake will look like a chocolate cake and taste like one. And so that's what you can think of as DNA as a recipe, and it's in code, and this large molecule reads the code to make the proteins.
And how long were you working on this before the discovery?
So I
And what led to this discovery?
started working on ribosomes in 1978, and essentially was working on it continuously from that time, with maybe one short break. And then the actual sort of, effort that led to the structure of the entire ribosome, my lab began in about 1995. Okay, so 78 to 95, we were attacking the ribosome in other ways, peripheral ways, before we found that, okay, it's possible to really tackle the whole thing. And that's what led to the final structures in our lab. So it's a very long process. And you could think, were the first 17 years wasted? And actually, no, because that gave you all the background and, made you think about the problem and made you, finally decide what the right approach would be and so on. So sure. I think, you have to think of it as a very long journey.
In the entrepreneurial world, many entrepreneurs go through pivots, and I believe in your background, you went through a pivot. You were physics, and then you turned to biology.
Yeah.
How did that happen?
I found myself not very interested in my PhD project. Mm-hmm. And at the time, biology was booming, and it still is booming. Life sciences are, amazingly in a big growth phase. And so I thought, well, maybe what I should do is go use my physics background, but somehow try and do something interesting in biology. Now, you mentioned the entrepreneurial thing, but there are other things as well. For example, when those approaches I was using for the ribosome were not fruitful, I thought, well, you really need to use crystallography to get atomic structures, first of pieces of the ribosome and then really of the whole ribosome. But I didn't know any crystallography, so I went on sabbatical to learn crystallography. And then now, crystallography is no longer used to study the ribosome. It's electron microscopy, which won the 2017 Nobel Prize.
Nobel Prize.
Okay. Now, so I had my lab quickly switch to, electron microscopy, and I said to myself, what am I? Am I interested in the ribosome, or am I interested in doing crystallography? You have to, in a business, you have to define what is it that you're doing. And I'll give you a classic example. Kodak. When I was a child, if you had told me Kodak would go bankrupt, I would have thought you were a lunatic.
Nobody would have believed it.
Okay?
Yeah.
I mean, it was just basically minting money, And some guy, so Kodak, oddly enough, developed one of the first photographic chips, okay? First digital chips were made in Kodak, And some guy, some high-up guy in Kodak said, well, we mustn't promote this too much because it'll cannibalize our film sales, okay? So they didn't realize they're not in the film business, they're in the imaging business, okay? So you have to define your goals properly. And so my goal was, I'm interested in the ribosome. If some other technique comes along that's better, I'm quite happy to switch.
Excellent.
So Professor, I'll take up this Kodak thing a little bit further, because the biggest cell therapy company right now in the world is Fujifilm, because they went into a completely different thing. What that does is life science entrepreneurs in India typically have to compete, when they're competing on the global stage, they have to compete with a Fujifilm or other companies which have access to much larger pools of money through grants or venture funding. You've gone up against, when you were uncovering the secrets of the ribosome, you were going up against much better funded people, and yet you succeeded. So tell us a little bit about what's the mindset that makes this possible.
Yeah, I think the mindset is you have to pick something where you think you have an edge. If you're going to do exactly the same thing as a big lab, then, what is it that you have that they're not going to be able to do? It's slightly different in business, because I'll tell you, even a big lab, like Tom Steitz's lab was very big, but the people who were working on the ribosome in his lab were only 2 or 3 people. So if I had 2 or 3 people and my 2 or 3 people were as good as his 2 or 3 people, it didn't matter about his other 20 people, So like with Fuji, Fuji may have a huge film business, it may have, camera business, it has all sorts of other businesses. But If their cell, business is of a scale that you could take on, then you could do it.
Yeah.
It doesn't matter that as long as you're sufficiently funded.
Of course.
So, in my case, one of the reasons I moved to England, taking a 40% pay cut, was to move to a very stably funded institution. So in business, I suppose it would mean that you don't want your sort of whatever it is, if you're funded by venture capital, you don't want that round of funding to dry up and then not have, second round of funding. You want to make sure you have enough funding stream until you actually achieve your goal. And I think that's probably the analogy.
I think the message is very simple. Even Nobel laureates have to think of funding like entrepreneurs.
Yes.
Excellent.
I've often joked that scientists are basically like CEOs of small companies. Company of 5-6 employees, and they have to essentially, make a pitch and, try and get funding, and
So again, my parallel to entrepreneurs will continue. Single-minded focus, you had small sort of stints outside in terms of discovering new tactics to achieve the single-minded focus. You took care of funding, you moved places. You took a pay cut, by the way. Entrepreneurs do that.
Yes.
As such. But
yeah,
what were the...
I have an entrepreneur friend who, for many years he was basically, not that well off.
Right.
Before he
So effectively, top couple of challenges faced, how did you address them? What were the key showstoppers that you faced? How did you overcome them? And what were they?
Well, I think, for example, getting crystals was the first big problem. And then we found our crystals were dying in the beam, and then we had to figure out how to, get around that, and we did that by a combination of brute force, by just screening thousands of crystals. So I don't know what the equivalent analogy would be, but basically what you have to do is try and adjust your method of operation so that you get your goals, you're making progress at a decent rate, even if it means sometimes just brute forcing the solution rather than trying to find an elegant solution.
Sure.
Often, ultimately you want an elegant solution, because brute force solutions are not, they're not usually viable. But let's say you're in a race to produce the first product, and being the first mover has a huge advantage, then of course, you may want to, pull out the stops.
Entrepreneurs face a lot of no's to their ideas. In fact, more no's than yeses in their journey to success.
Yes.
Did you face the same thing?
Yeah, I think so. And I think in science, I often joke that 90% of the time, things are not really working. So I think maybe there's one thing that's common to entrepreneurs and scientists, that they're both optimists. Because if you're not an optimist, you would simply leave the field.
And give up, yeah.
You would give up, you'd go get a routine job, and you do something else. Entrepreneurs and scientists have to be sort of feel that, oh no, it's eventually going to work out.
And did you at any point of time think you're going to win the Nobel Prize?
Not for a very long time. But there comes a time when you've made your breakthroughs, other people have made their breakthroughs, and then the community actually, when you go and give talks
Starts
or
recognizing,
something,
yeah.
they say, this could win the Nobel Prize. And when you hear it often enough, you start thinking, oh, well, maybe there's a chance. There's never any guarantee that you'd get it, but, and of course, it could go to other fields. That's very common. But it could also, even if they give it to your field, it could go to some other people rather than you,
Yeah.
So there's always, you can never, and there was, for personal reasons, I felt that I would not get the Nobel Prize, partly because I had a quarrel, scientific quarrel with somebody who then went on the Nobel Committee. And so I was sure that, I wasn't going to get it, actually. So I was a bit surprised, but,
That's like an entrepreneur having a quarrel with a board member.
yes,
Yeah.
possibly.
Happens all the
Or
time.
a funder, actually.
Or a funder.
Much worse. Talk to us a little bit about collaboration and how, there are a lot of silos in science, there are a lot of silos in startups as well. How do you know what to collaborate and who to collaborate with versus what do you keep or you don't?
So, I've written about competition and collaboration in my book. So my book, which is over there, it's really a memoir of the whole race. It's not an autobiography. There's enough about me just to give some context, but really it's about the race for the ribosome. And one of the things I say is it's not that different from business in that scientists will collaborate and compete. And sometimes they'll collaborate and compete with the same person on different things.
Yes.
They'll collaborate on one thing and compete on another.
Yeah.
And you have that in business as well. Apple and Samsung, they actually have collaborative agreements, for screens and all sorts of things.
Yes.
But they're also fierce competitors, And so I think, you have to go case by case. Now, there is a kind of ideology that, competition is very bad, people should get along and they should all collaborate because you're wasting money otherwise. Why should 3 people do the same thing, etc. But I can tell you, when the ribosome project was dominated by one person, it was sort of chugging along, but there's not really a big structural breakthrough after of course, that person made the initial crystallization breakthrough, Ada Yonat. But, 15 years later, there was really no progress towards an actual structure. As soon as 3 other groups entered it, within 2 years, the structure was solved. I mean, it was just basically, the field exploded, Actually, not 2 years, but within 3 or 4 years, the structure was basically solved. And so I think this is a case where, competition makes you work harder, think harder, etc. So I think competition is good for science. It's not so good for scientists. And I'm sure it's true for this in business. It's good for business. It's good for the customer,
Yes.
okay? But it's not good for the individuals because it's very stressful.
But you would argue ultimately it's good for the individual as well because that's the only way to succeed finally.
Yes, in the end. Well, I think most entrepreneurs would end up like to be a monopoly,
Sure.
So you mentioned customer. Fast forward, equating your discovery to a prototype, and fast forward to today. What have been the applications? Has some of the research got into a product or a service and reached customers today?
Yeah, so, I'll talk about this later, when I give my talk. The gap between a basic discovery and an application can be very long, okay? I'll give you one example is the discovery of the laws of gravitation by Newton, okay? That was in the 1600s or so. Now, you could not imagine satellites, without Newton's laws of motion, or rockets, okay? That's like 300 years, and Newton could not have even conceived of satellites or rockets, he never did. Similarly, Faraday and electricity, you couldn't imagine, satellite communication and electricity being related to electricity. Or I'll give you a very weird example, general relativity and special relativity, the nature of space and time by Einstein, 1905 and then, 1918. Einstein could never have imagined that the fabric of space and time would allow somebody to navigate around Bangalore with this little device, But GPS would not work without relativistic corrections, okay? So it's a very long thing. Now, sometimes, you can go, the period can be very short, like with transistors. It came out of fundamental quantum mechanics, but it was almost immediately applied. So the gap can be very small or very long. It's not predictable. And in my own case, ribosomes are very fundamental to biology, but they're also the target of antibiotics, of lots of antibiotics. And what I and Tom Stites and others did was we collaborated. Tom Stites actually founded a company, and I first was on the SAB of a company, and then I was on the SAB of Tom Stites' company, to make new compounds that would be better antibiotics based on these structures. Now, this company, I don't even know if it exists anymore because it was bought and then may have been rebought. But they basically had a number of compounds which worked in the lab, etc. But going from there to clinical trials is very, very expensive, okay? And they tried to float the company, but when they tried, they found the share price they commanded was much less than what the investors had already put in. So they withdrew the IPO, okay? The same month, a company that's main goal, main product is to, share gossip and fake news and so on, was worth hundreds of billions of dollars, okay? I don't have a Facebook account, but I don't know anyone who's died because they didn't have a Facebook account. I know people who have died because of Facebook, probably, So I think, this is a business model that's broken. And this is one case, like antibiotics and infectious disease. We have to remember penicillin was not made by a private company. It was done by the British government in response to the war. So maybe some things in medicine are not necessarily for private. Industry. They need to be some, government or non-profit funded enterprise.
And do you think, coming back to India now from Globe, Indian government has a role to play in some of these to take it forward, and they can actually lead the world there?
I think they could, there are a number of cases, infectious diseases are much more prevalent in India.
In India, yeah.
So it is a natural place in which to study them, to find out more about the pathology, identify new targets for drugs, and, and then develop, India has lots of medicinal chemists. The generic drug industry in India is booming,
yes.
Okay? And one of the world's largest generic drug. So that means they have the chemistry, What they have to have is the molecular biology and biochemistry, which allows them to make new medicines.
Excellent.
I'll take you up on this whole thing about the building blocks of basic science that happen in academic institutions where the government plays a role, right? We've often seen, especially in India, that these discoveries do not make the transition to some entrepreneurs picking it up. Sometimes it's locked away just because a PhD student finished his PhD thesis and then went abroad, and then it's locked away.
Yeah.
How do we unlock that potential?
Yeah, that's a very difficult problem because, Britain is also, had this problem and still does have it. In Britain now, so 20 years ago, Britain had the same problem, that fundamental discoveries would be made in Britain. British scientists would get Nobel Prizes, right, and some American would get very rich,
yes,
from British discoveries.
Yes.
It goes all the way back to penicillin, radar, you name it, DNA sequencing, all sorts of things. And now what's happened is Britain has encouraged entrepreneurship. It's very easy now to set up companies.
Right.
But the scale-up problem in Britain is still an issue. So now what happens is British companies will reach the 200-300 million capitalization stage, and then they'll sell out to Americans. So
right,
DeepMind, one of the world's best AI companies,
right,
was bought by Google. Solexa, which was the basis of all next generation's DNA sequencing, right, was bought by Illumina. So you do have this problem at all stages. Now you asked, how do you do the first transfer?
yes,
That's a more difficult problem, and the problem I see is this. Every student or postdoc in a university only sees one role model.
Right.
The role model is their professor,
right,
who's an academic.
yes,
They don't see the entrepreneurs. They're not on campus, okay? And so they don't have any other example. They're not even thinking
yes,
about, oh, this thing could be the basis of some application. So I think what has to happen is institutions need to set up, centers for entrepreneurship. They need to train people in entrepreneurship. Entrepreneurs need to go to campuses and tell their stories. For example, in Trinity College, we have a once monthly evening. You know, Cambridge is full of science park. You know, it has like, I don't know, probably 1,000 startups, but certainly several hundred. And what we do is we choose 2 or 3 to come to Trinity College and tell their stories of how they got going, etc. And it often started with some basic science. So unless you make the effort to bridge that gap, it's not going to happen. And it's not just up to government. Government can provide incentives. They can provide seed money. They can provide tax breaks. They can possibly provide land for startup companies.
Startups, sure.
You know, things like that. But the culture thing is more difficult. That has to come from people.
Maybe one final question. India is booming with entrepreneurs. Every year, tens of thousands of entrepreneurs are starting new businesses, most of them actually in technology overall. From your experiences and any quick 3 or 4 pointers to entrepreneurs to succeed on a global platform, especially when there is deep science involved and deep technology?
Yeah, I would be I'm sorry, I'm probably the wrong guy to ask. I don't really know, except to say, you know, you have to find, first of all, your own niche so that you're not constantly competing with the big players in a field. Or you have to be able to be better or cheaper, you know, at your thing. But that's just a very obvious statement. I don't really know how. I would say if you want to be global, you have to also act globally and have global connections. That's one useful thing you can have, is connecting with scientists abroad, with complementary companies abroad. So that's the only way to sort of get known as a global player. But you know, there are companies, especially in the IT sector, and pharmaceutical sector, where India's had great success.
And good scale.
Global.
Yes.
And
Sorry?
good scale. And good scale.
Yeah, at good scale, yeah. India's large enough to have scale.
Yes.
That's its big advantage, you know, that it's, you know, 1.2 billion, it has an economy that's still growing. So I think, you know, there's no reason not to be global.
And I think one final thing, given that we have established it takes a long time and it's not for the faint-hearted, you have to start with purpose, because that's the one thing that's going to get you along. So
Yeah, I have to say I admire entrepreneurs because, you know, scientists take risks, but, you know, many of us are at the stage when we take a risk, we still have a job. And so among scientists, I admire really the students and postdocs who take a risk, because if it doesn't work, you know, their career can get derailed and so on. I don't admire the professors and scientists too much. But with entrepreneurs, it's different. You know, many of them put their own money in when they start up. And, you know, if they don't make it, they don't have a job, you know, at the end. So I think it's more of a challenge.
Thank you, Dr. Venkatraman. Really motivational. And we look forward to seeing you more and more in India, and hopefully more and more with entrepreneurs.
I come every year, you know.
Yeah.
So.
Thank you.
thank you.